Great, and thank you. I have the fortunate position of being the last speaker of the day, I believe. So bear with me. If you have any questions, please let me know. But just to explain a little bit of my background, which I think is relevant for this conference. For the first part of my career, I practiced as a litigator for the first 11 years. And then I moved in-house and joined Axon & Bell, and I'll tell you a little bit more about Axon & Bell in a minute. And shifted over to a compliance role, which is where I've been for the past few years. And specifically, I head up our investigations function at Axon & Bell, which, as we addressed a little bit earlier through Gabe, Axon & Bell, like many companies, has seen our compliance function grow substantially over the past few years. And as part of that growth, I was appointed as a director of investigations. So we have a very extensive internal whistleblower mechanism where our employees and also external third parties have an opportunity to report directly to us, anonymously or identified, potential issues that they observe where there might be violations of our code of conduct. And that mechanism is very important. And each of those cases comes to me initially, directly, and I screen the cases to determine what the significance is, what the risk level is, and assign those cases out to a number of our compliance managers who are spread across the world. The intersect between litigation and compliance is very, very close. And in my role, what I try to do, and through our function, is we try to identify and prevent issues that could ultimately lead to litigation or could lead to governmental authorities knocking on our door. That's essentially the goal, not just of running an ethical company, a sustainable company, but also preventing this type of risk. And that's why I view the compliance function as being so important to mitigating and preventing those types of risks within a company. So first, just a little bit about Axon & Bell. Axon & Bell is a global decorative paints, performance coatings, and specialty chemicals company, headquartered in the Netherlands, but with operations across the globe. Last year, about $14 billion in revenue, 46,000 employees, and quite an expansive span across the globe, about 80-plus countries that we operate in. We have 4 end-user segments: buildings, infrastructure, transportation, consumer goods, industrial. It's one of those companies that you probably haven't heard directly of Axon & Bell because you don't go to a store and for the most part buy Axon & Bell products. Instead, our products go inside of products. And we do have many, many brands, though. And some of our brands you've probably heard of. Axon & Bell, International Paint, Dulux, Coral, decorative paints that go on the walls, performance coatings that go on buildings, cruise ships, airplanes, cars, washers and dryers, and then specialty chemicals that go into a number of consumer products, agricultural products, chemicals products. So as I started out, compliance is, in my opinion, very closely linked to litigation. Sometimes compliance can lead to litigation, can lead to regulatory bodies coming to us, or we can disclose issues to the regulatory agencies if that is appropriate. In other instances, litigation may come to us directly, and we may determine as a result of litigation that there's an inherent compliance risk that needs to be resolved or fixed. So it's a two-way path. But ultimately, with the compliance program, what we're trying to avoid is cut down on the litigation, cut down on the governmental authorities coming to us. And that's one of the goals of our compliance program, as well as when we are conducting internal investigations. Main goals of a compliance program. It's really threefold, in my opinion. First, you have to educate the employees on what the relevant rules are. Okay? If your employees don't understand what the policies are, what the procedures are, what the rules are, essentially what the expectations are, how can you operate in a compliant fashion? Very, very difficult. So with large multinational companies, this is a challenging issue. This is not as easy as just developing the policies, because you have to communicate those policies to many, many employees around the world and try to communicate those policies in their local languages. And for a company like Axon & Bell, where you have many, many local languages, that can mean translating your policies and procedures so that they are understandable, comprehensible to the employees in the various jurisdictions in which you're operating. So that's number one. Also, your employees need to know where they can access your policies, your directives, the expectations. If they don't know where they are, how are you going to expect them to understand what those policies are? So, as part of an onboarding process, when your employees are initially hired, I recommend the company should spend a significant amount of time explaining, here are where the policies are. On this portal, the website, have them always available, have them updated. If you have significant updates, have email blasts out to your companies, informing them of those updates and what the significant changes have been. It's critical for your employees to understand what the expectations are. Now, is it enough? Is it enough just to have policies and procedures and manuals? In my opinion, it's not. That's a starting point. Okay? You need to train your employees on what those policies and procedures are. That can take a variety of formats. That can be e-learnings, that can be face-to-face trainings. Okay? Sometimes it's impossible to do face-to-face trainings for every single compliance subject for every single employee. That may not be reasonable. But when appropriate and when possible, face-to-face trainings, in my experience, are the most effective. For two reasons. First, you're communicating your policies, and I would recommend using actual examples, okay? Actual dilemmas that your employees can work with in small roundtables and debate and discuss the complicated compliance issues that they may face in their work environments. But the other benefit of face-to-face trainings is that compliance professionals, legal professionals, business managers also tend to get those interesting questions during those trainings, or perhaps are alerted to compliance issues that maybe they otherwise wouldn't have been alerted to if you didn't have that face-to-face meeting. There's a lot of value in face-to-face meetings. Other methods of communicating can include compliance newsletters. A lot of companies are now investing in compliance apps so that it's downloaded on every employee's phone or iPhone, so they always have a compliance app with policies and procedures that may be applicable to them, such as like travel and expense reimbursement, which employees often want to access when they're traveling. That's another, perhaps, approach that you can take. Gabe discussed earlier, what extent do we need to have our employees actually acknowledge or confirm that they understand the policies? A lot of companies are doing that, including Axe and Nobel, where during onboarding, you provide a copy of your code of conduct. You have them sign an acknowledgement form that they've read the code of conduct, they understand it, and they will conduct their business operations in conformance with the code of conduct. But is that enough? You can go farther. At Axe and Nobel, what we are doing now on an annual basis is through our employee performance and development, annual performance and development review process, we are asking each of our employees and requiring them to confirm that they have conformed with the code of conduct, or if not, identify any issues that they're aware of. And that's a requirement in order for them to complete their P&D process, performance and development, annually. Another important aspect of a compliance program, you have to create a culture of compliance, okay? It's not enough just to have these policies, and it really begins with the tone at the top. Encouraging your executives, your top management, to really believe and communicate the message of compliance, that it's not just winning business, it's winning business in a compliant fashion, okay? And demonstrating, putting actions behind those words, right? And that comes a lot to the compliance function, which is if you observe someone acting in a non-compliant fashion, taking the necessary steps to institute sanctions so that you are delivering a message to your organization, this is what our expectations are. But it's not just sanctioning those who commit violations of your code of conduct. It's also acknowledging and perhaps rewarding, and many companies differ on this, those employees that bring issues to your attention. Okay? It can be very difficult for an employee, even in the best whistleblower program where you have policies of non-retaliation and confidentiality and anonymity. It can be very difficult, especially in certain cultures, for employees to come forward and identify issues. And you need to create an environment inherent in your organization to encourage those employees to do that and to reward them when they do make that decision to alert you to these issues. Promoting Speak Up is very closely related to that. So you have to promote your internal whistleblower mechanism. Okay. As companies, we would much prefer employees coming to us internally directly and identifying potential issues for us so that we can investigate, rather than going to external government authorities in the first instance. We'd like to be able to know about the issue so we can take corrective actions and perhaps if we need to inform the authorities ourselves. And that leads into this slide, which is the whistleblower programs can very effectively reduce litigation risks and potential fines. You have to let your employees know, though, what the whistleblower program entails. Okay, how do they raise a potential violation of your code of conduct? A lot of companies use websites hosted by a NAVEX, like an ethics point, where you can go to a website and upload a potential violation of code of conduct. We at Axon Bell also have hotlines where an employee across the world can dial a phone number locally and speak with someone and raise an issue. We also have an internal email address, Speak Up, where employees can raise issues through an email, and then we always inform our employees that another mechanism is you can speak to your manager, you can come to legal and compliance directly. But our employees need to know that that is available. Make it easy and accessible. Okay. Then you have to take steps to protect your whistleblowers. They have to know that if they raise these issues, that so long as they're raising a complaint or a potential violation in good faith, that they will be protected. Okay. And at Axon Bell, we ensure 3 core principles for our speak-up mechanism: is confidentiality, anonymity, and non-retaliation. Make those very clear, because employees can be quite nervous or anxious about raising a potential issue internally. And then, as I mentioned, reporting obligations. At Axon Bell, it's an obligation, a requirement for our employees, if they are aware of a potential violation of the code of conduct, to bring that to the attention of legal and compliance. Okay? Failure to do so in and of itself is a violation of our code of conduct. It is a requirement. Okay? And I encourage employees to do that. I can take questions now, but or save it for then. And have a potential incentive program. Many companies are experimenting with that. Here's an example of something that's not a specific incentive program that we have, but again, acknowledging employees who do the right thing. This is an example of a follow-up action that was identified in a recent investigation report that I prepared on a non-confidential basis, in which an employee identified, flagged an issue, which did result in an investigation. As a result of the investigation, we found that there was some validity to the allegation that was brought to our attention. So what can you do? In that situation, you can take a sanction against the individual who committed the code of conduct violation and stop there, okay, and resolve the situation that way. But, what good, that does good by eliminating the issue, correcting the issue with that specific individual. But I recommend going farther, and that's going back to the reporter and having the reporter be contacted by someone very senior on the business side within the organization, within their function, and have them go to them and say, thank you, on a confidential basis, we've limited the disclosure of this information, but thank you for flagging these issues. You did the right thing. And commend them for bringing these issues to their attention. Even though it's an obligation, I think our employees should be reminded that they did the right thing. And then, if possible, give them credit for that as part of your annual review process. So have it sit in with real, meaningful impact. When doing an investigation, if done correctly, you can control litigation risk as well. So when you're conducting internal investigations, there are a couple things to keep in mind. First, you have to decide when to commence or conclude an investigation. Okay? Generally speaking, when you receive a report, it's in your best interest to commence an investigation as quickly as possible. If you learn about a potential issue and sit on it, and the governmental authorities come knocking at your door, they're going to look at that and say, why didn't you do something sooner? Why is it that you waited several months before starting to investigate this issue or bring it to our attention? That's not good. When you get a complaint, you begin investigating it as quickly as you can. There are also appropriate times when you may want to consider concluding an investigation. I've had instances where an investigation begins because a report is filed, but then the reporter files a litigation against the company. Okay? In those situations, I say, hands off. We're going to stop our internal investigation. We're handing this over specifically to our legal colleagues because now this is in the context of an active litigation. So we're not going to proceed with this investigation in a compliant function. Instead, it's going to go strictly to legal. So think about it from both sides. Confidentiality. Confidentiality is a difficult concept in the compliance world because inevitably you're going to have to disclose some facts in conducting an investigation. But the key is you want to keep those facts and the individuals who know about the investigation to as small as a group as possible. And that's what we communicate to our reporters. is that we will treat this with as much confidence as we possibly can. Attorney-client privilege and work product. When you're conducting an investigation, keep these principles in mind, okay? Especially in Europe, as a result of a decision with Action Nobel in it. Attorney-client privilege can be difficult to obtain at certain times. And in terms of having internal attorney-client privilege, it's very, very difficult. So if you sense that an investigation may be subject ultimately to a government investigation, consider bringing in outside counsel and then conducting the investigation at the request or upon the direction of outside counsel so you can maintain privileges if that may be appropriate. And the same thing with work product protections. Privacy protections. It's a changing world where privacy is becoming more and more important, especially in Europe. When you're conducting an investigation, you have to be aware of what the privacy obligations are that you have to different individuals that you may be investigating. Do you have to disclose that they're the subject of an investigation? Do you have to identify that you are obtaining their emails or obtain their consent? At what point in the investigation do you have to make those disclosures? Keep those types of issues in mind. If you are taking emails from one jurisdiction and transmitting it across a border to be reviewed somewhere else, also check jurisdictional rules. Document preservation notice and litigation hold. Again, this comes in the context if you're starting an investigation and you get the sense that you may need to disclose it to the authorities or they might be knocking on your door at some point, issue those document preservation notices, litigation hold, so your documents are preserved. And be aware of local laws. At the conclusion of an investigation, you have to keep a very good record of what you've done. Because ultimately, if you're in litigation at the end or if the regulatory authority comes to you, you want to be able to document how seriously you took the allegations and the steps that you also took. So I encourage you that if you're doing interviews, that you should have the individual who's conducting interviews first be trained in the skill or the art of conducting an interview and then document, memorialize the facts that occurred during the interview. Ideally, you'd have the individual who was interviewed also review those facts and sign on to them so that everybody is in agreement with what occurred. So you don't want to be in a he said situation or he said, she said. So if it's a very important interview that you think might become an issue that could be debated down the road, you might want to have two individuals from the company or someone in the company, an external counsel, conducting the interview so that you have somebody who can serve as another witness about what occurred if you can't get that individual to sign a summary. Investigation reports are key. And in an investigation report, at minimum, you should include the allegations or issues that were to be investigated, the investigation process, how you went about investigating the issues, if you collected documents, who you spoke with, if you pulled other materials, financial materials, everything that you did, the key information in terms of the investigation process, key facts that you establish, and then an analysis. So based on the allegations and the facts that you were able to establish as a result of the investigation, are the allegations substantiated or unsubstantiated? Okay, and the rationale and the reasoning behind it. Then you may want to go a step further and say, okay, it's not just enough for us to determine if there was a violation, we want to know how it happened. Because that is even more important to us as an organization because we want to prevent this issue from occurring again. So how did it happen and what type of corrections do we need to take? Do we need to improve our policies and procedures, improve our communications? And that's the analysis and the root cause. Sanctions and other follow-up actions. Include that in your investigation report. You also want to have consistency as best you can in the sanctions that you render. So a large multinational company like a Johnson Controls and Action Nobel, what you're trying to establish is that if you have a set of allegations that are proven to be substantiated in one business unit versus another business unit, and regardless of region of the world, you have the same decision and you have the same sanction. And it's not always, it could be difficult at times, but what you may want to do is, at your companies or for your external clients, encourage them to develop a set of sanction guidelines that at least outlines the steps and the thought process behind how are you arriving at a particular sanction. Preserve communications with the reporter and the subject. At the conclusion of an investigation, you want to report the outcome to both the reporter and the subject. And you want to preserve those communications. And you want to make sure, as part of the investigation process, that you're giving both the reporter and the subject or subjects an opportunity to be heard. Okay? Just because a reporter files a matter doesn't mean that that's the only communication you should have with the reporter. You should follow up with the reporter to the extent you can, and it's not anonymous. He or she's not anonymous, and request an interview, get additional documentation so you get a complete set of facts from the reporter. Also, interview the subject, okay? Don't just arrive at a conclusion about whether a case is substantiated or not without interviewing the person who might be subject to those sanctions. Companies have different approaches on sharing investigation reports, the actual report itself with the reporter, with the subject. There are some advantages and disadvantages of both approaches. At Action & Bell, we do not share our final investigation reports with either the reporter or the subject, and the main reason for that is because we are ensuring the confidentiality of the process. So to the extent that the investigation report reveals other individuals who served as witnesses, we believe it's in the company's best interest to preserve the confidentiality of those reports. At the conclusion of an investigation, you should decide whether you have any disclosure obligations, and those can take a variety of forms, and I think, Gabe, you touched upon this a little bit as well. So you have internal disclosure obligations, potentially to board of directors, audit committee, external auditors you may need to make a disclosure to, government agencies, regulatory bodies, and then also don't forget, you may have a disclosure obligation to third parties, including perhaps your customers. Take a look at those contracts, because your customers may have their own business partner code of conduct or may have some own requirements, and you may, as a result of your investigation, find that you violated one of those terms, and then you have to look at that contract closely and determine if you need to inform your customer of those potential issues. You may contractually have a legal obligation to do so. Investigation findings. So what do? You can, as I said, address the situation, obviously, if it's substantiated with the individuals who committed the code of conduct violation, but don't stop there, okay? I think one of the biggest danger areas is operating in silos. So you take this information that you learn, which is quite valuable, okay, of a potential violation, and you may see that this could have relevance to other businesses within the region or outside the region where this risk or this violation that occurred here may be a similar risk that others are facing and may not be aware of. You want to be able, on a confidential basis, disclose that information to your other business clients and alert them to these issues so that they can take potential steps to avoid the situations that you are observing or the violations that you found in one business or region. Okay, so don't address these issues in isolation. Share the lessons and follow up with other functions. If you identify an issue and you change your policies and procedures, you may also have an internal audit function, or you can get external auditors or outside counsel to come in 6 months later or a year later to then test whether the new policies and procedures are now adequately being followed. So that's the end of my presentation, and